brown paper bag out of the closet and proceeded to pull everything out of all these brown paper bags and covered, like the floor and everything else. And I had a wonderful introduction to J. Ottman lithographing, and of course I had heard of J. Ottman and Kepler in the Puck building, but to put all of that together with Jackie was a real treat for me. We have a large Kepler collection at the Historical Society and a large collection of what we call caricatures, cartoons from the late 18th into the 19th and 20th century. So this material, when you called me, I realized was perfect, and of course I am thrilled that more than your gifting a lot of this does was the opportunity to meet you and become friends with you. So
thank you.
That's one of the great parts about my job, is getting to know people and making friends. And this was a good one. So thanks. I've been studying lithography for a lot of years, really since I went to Northwestern University for my graduate studies, and they allowed me to take printmaking along with the academic studies, along with the academic classes. So I actually took a lithography workshop. My art shop was the only B I got in graduate school because I ran out of ideas. I can research, but when it comes to doing all that stuff on the stones, I know how to do it, but my creativity stuff. What? What?
What a lithograph is.
I will. Okay. So I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about first J. Ottman and the fact that he was from Germany. And I really started to think about a lot of this morning. He came over in 1868, right, Jackie? And in 1876, he went in with Mayor Merkel, and he was out on his own by 85 when he moved into the Puck building. But I think that one thing that's very important in this whole story is that lithography was invented in Germany. And a lot of the great lithographers came here from Germany. It was invented in the late 18th century by a man by the name of Alois Sennefelder, whose mother, legend goes, said, I want you to do this laundry for me, and he had to write down a list, and he had nothing to write it on, so he had all these Bavarian stones in front of him. He just wrote the list on the stones and realized that if he went through a number of different steps, he could fix that image into the stone and then print it. And so he started doing that. Thus was the birth of lithography, which is a printmaking process in which we use, well, they used to, now they use sheets of mylar and sometimes aluminum. But they used to use these very heavy Bavarian limestones that are about this thick. And if you tried to lift a limestone, you couldn't. It would weigh like over 100 pounds. They're very, very dense. And the image is drawn on a polished limestone, and then it goes through 5 or 6 different chemical processes. And finally, you get to the point where the image is fixed in the stone, and it's ready to print. You ink up the stone, and because of all of the processes that you've gone through, the ink will stick to the drawn images, and it will be rejected by the images that have the area on the stone that doesn't have the lithographic ink on it. That's a simplified version. It gets very complicated. And in order to do a color lithograph, one has to have a different stone for each color. So it's a very intensive kind of a process. Color lithography really began in about 1840, but it was between 1850 and 1875 that it just took off, right at the time that Jacob Oppen came here. And it's tied in very much with the fact that after the Civil War, there was an explosion of industrialization, which we all know. And there were railroad trains that went from the East Coast into the Midwest, and hence the rise of a lot of advertising, which Ottman did a lot, and hence the rise also of a lot of journals with pictures in them. And now that there was a postal service that could send things out to the Midwest and trains that could take them out there, there was all of a sudden this huge market that opened up, and a reason to use lithography to mass produce a lot of images, which is why I think Ottman Lithographing Company was in at the right place at the right time and became very successful. So successful that they occupied this entire building. This building is a landmark in the city of New York, and probably one of the most famous and favored landmarks. It's one of my favorite buildings in the city. And I've seen references to the fact that it's Italianate Renaissance. It's not. It's Romanesque Renaissance with a little bit of Italian mixed in. The Romanesque is the very rounded arches and the heavy stones. And also, it is a wonderful example of cast iron architecture. You can see these cast iron columns here, which are very typical of late 19th century. Yes?
It had to be, but the building was built so that it could support the presses.
Right, exactly. And it needed that strength and that kind of architecture because at one time I think there were 40 presses in this building.
Wow.
And lithography presses
300.
are 300?
300.
Yeah, couple, I mean, and they are huge and heavy. So, you know, it took a lot for me when I first realized it. And I had said to you, I thought that the firm occupied a lot of the building. I didn't realize it was the whole building, but they were dealing in so many different kinds and pieces of advertising and trading cards, which you see up on this wall, and cartoons from Puck Magazine, which you see over here. Puck Magazine comes out of a tradition of magazines in America in the mid-19th century, beginning with things like Leslie's and Harper's Magazine, in which you had very famous artists illustrating. Winslow Homer worked for Harper's Magazine for many years, but he did wood engravings because at that point they weren't doing lithography for illustrations. And Homer did the wood engravings until about the early 1870s. Then he left and did his watercolors and everything else for which he's so famous. But that's again about the time that these other magazines with color illustrations started to become very popular and the technology was available. And hence we have Jacob Ottman coming in, pairing with Kepler, who was a very, very famous political satirist, and it was like a perfect marriage between the two of them. And therefore the growth of J. Ottman Company and what we see on the walls right now. The early issues of Puck Magazine were in German because of the German background at Merkel, Mayer, and Ottman, and it ties in right with the German heritage of lithography as well. So it really all comes together in this way and makes a perfect story. So thank you for bringing all this to us and opening it up to me, and I'd love to answer questions. I don't want to keep you guys standing for too long, but if you have questions, please. Lithography stayed popular probably until the 1890s when photography took over. Photography was invented in 1837, but it took a while for it to take hold and for them to figure out ways to then reproduce it. And by the 1890s, you'll see photography in books and magazines far more than you see lithography and etching and everything else that they use. Gravure is very popular.
I can add a couple of little things here. Some of you may have heard of the Columbian Exposition of 1893. It was in Chicago, and it was America's chance to finally, for the first time, display its state-of-the-art technology to the world. And in order to get into the fair as an exhibitor, you had to be selected. And J. Ottman Lithographing was selected as the lithographer at the fair. And they actually built a mini Puck building for their exhibit space, and they published a daily newspaper for the fair. And so that was kind of a big deal. And the other thing is the magazine was eventually bought. Jacob Ottman died in around 1889. And then one of his brothers, actually it was Mike's great-grandfather, took over. One of the brothers who were in the meat business switched over and stayed in the lithography business. But they took over, and then they eventually sold it to William Randolph Hearst. Everybody knows that name. And Hearst eventually closed the magazine in 1918. So that's another little tidbit of interest, potentially.
Yeah, the other thing you should really look at, and a lot of people know about the political cartoons, and they're a lot of fun to look at, but the trading cards. Ottman and Company was the first firm that did trading cards to order. They didn't just take stock pictures and do them. They would individualize them for every company. And so they're very unique in that way. And one of the things that we look at trading cards for is a wonderful insight into what life was like at that time. So take a special look at these because I think they're a lot of fun and give us a lot of insight into everyday life in the late 19th century. Yes?
What is a trading card, actually?
They were advertising cards. They were little advertising cards that people gave away.
And can you tell us about the games?
The games, well, you know what?
Do you want to?
Okay, a few things about the games.
Step up.
Step up.
All right.